Reel a Genre, the show for readers who will never trust an eel again. Right now we are reading every short story in Ann and Jeff VanderMeer's The Weird Anthology, including this one, Mercè Rodoreda's The Salamander. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in style, dreaminess, how it feels like the kind of metamorphosis narrative is taken to a very strange and personal direction in this one.
And Bob, I'm interested in the same thing, Zach. It feels like dream logic. It feels like this story is trying to take different symbols and kind of tangentially take them in a new direction. It's like all of these associations that seem like the unconscious is making these decisions and moving forward with this story. But it does remind me of two stories we've read before. It reminds me a lot of the Axolotl story by Julio Cortázar. And it reminds me a lot of the Sanatorium story by Bruno Schultz. It feels almost like the two have combined to, not just in the themes of like, oh, there's an axolotl similar to a salamander. There's something about the very structure of those two stories where dreams or a relationship with an object or something else becomes central to the actual narration, to the very architecture, or the very like, go forwardness of the story. It really builds the story forward. It's like the plot is affected by these really strange, dreamy relationships.
Well, before we begin, I got to share some bad news about this author, because her life is confusing and emotionally distressing for even me as a reader decades later to read about. So she was withdrawn from school at age 9 or 10. At 20, she married or was married to her uncle, but because of consanguinity, basically fears of incest, the marriage required a papal dispensation to carry forward, which they got. And then in the 1950s, she mysteriously lost the use of her right arm. So one day her arm just stopped working, which now that I think about it makes that moment in the story where her salamander hand falls off or is pulled off by eels feel like very autobiographically laden. But hadn't thought of that before. But anyways, my point being is this author's life is just this. When you look at the bullet points of it, it's just like, my God, good God.
And I feel like those terrible things happening to you, it seems to be the narrative of the story too. There's random events that don't seem fair at all, that seem almost deliberately cruel towards this narrator. She is just minding her own business at the Willow. She's accosted by a frog who seems to be a frog man and then becomes a man. They end up in a like kind of violent almost relationship, and then it becomes consensual. So it doesn't feel right at all the entire time. And then that guy's wife shows up almost like a nightmare, because it's just her blonde braid hanging down from the tree as if she's been watching this woman the whole time. She's then accused of being a witch for no good reason at all. And as they think she's a witch, they take her to the stake. They're going to burn her. They successfully burn her. People just laugh at her. The old woman says, ho, 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 she won't burn, goes and gets dry heather, puts it down there, and they burn her up. Then she escapes somehow, turning into a salamander. But even then, she's chased. People just keep chasing her around. It feels like, you don't know how much, I guess, an author's life influences the story, but you could see a life with a lot of turmoil and kind of almost deliberate, just cruelty. And it's the same thing happening to this narrator, just step by step by step.
One part that was left out in that bizarre and head-spinning summary was that very emotionally complex, very emotionally conflicting moment where, as a salamander, she crawls into the bedroom of her lover assailant and basically makes a nest underneath the bed of him and his wife. And then at night, she crawls up and nestles against his leg. And then, when morning comes, she crawls back down under the bed into her nest, until one day, of course, the wife discovers her and chases her out with a broom, I believe. Maybe she throws something at her. Yeah, either way. what did you make of this moment? It's so complicated emotionally. I don't even know how to begin to pick this thing apart.
Yeah, it's really hard to know. We just know he seems to be a really bad guy, but it's kind of unclear exactly how bad he is, but we know he's not good at all. I don't know why she goes back to him. The salamander, crawling into the bed, it seems to be the only safe place for a few days because once she's discovered, she's living under the bed after being in the bed. And even when she's sleeping up there, it's like he leans over on the little salamander and the salamander can't even breathe. Then when she's under the bed, she's safe for a while until the wife, like you said, sweeps her out. But no matter where she goes, she's persecuted. Rocks are thrown at her. Boys see her float up in I think it's a horse trough because it's a horse trough. They throw rocks at her. And even the eels go after her. It's just terrible. It's hard to pick apart at all, but it is interesting to see persecution, but then transformation. And while she transforms into a salamander, it's like the whole world is also transforming in front of her. And there's this weird kind of reciprocal, there's like a feedback loop, I guess, this relationship between her transformations and then the world becoming more cruel and also turning as she transforms. It's just, that's why it reminds me a lot of the Bruno Schultz story of dreaming your father is alive, going to see that your father really is alive, seeing that you almost have two fathers, and then seeing a man who looks like a dog, seeing a dog who looks like a man, seeing a man who looks like a dog. This seems to be what's happening to her too. She can't even distinguish, like, am I seeing things as a salamander or am I seeing things as a human now? There's, even in the actual narration and the style of the story, regardless of the events, there's something very disturbing about it.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is kind of the strange and twisting nature of the transformation, because like, even though she changes into a salamander, or maybe I should say, even though she narrates the fact of having turned into a salamander, I don't get the sense that she actually changed as an individual. Does that make sense? Like, she still reads like a person, the same kind of persecuted person. Like even in Kafka, which is kind of notoriously deadpan about the fact that the guy turned into a bug. Oh, I woke up this morning and I had turned into an insect, Oh, darn, kind of a feeling. Even that felt a little bit more rueful over the fact of having turned into, something else. But then in the eyes of others, it seems like she's been transformed into a witch. You know what I mean? Like, there's transformations happening all around. And I do want to say that it does not seem coincidental that, she transformed into, we covered in our John Silence stories, Paracelsus, the idea of elementals, these elemental beings that govern the four elements of earth. And the salamander is, of course, the fire elemental. Well, what does she turn into while she's being burned? A salamander. It seems not coincidental to me.
Yes, that's why it feels, again, like dream logic to be burned and then turn into a salamander. It's very different because the salamander is wet. It's a little lizard, but it seems like fire. What is the ultimate thing that represents fire? Fire, suddenly, oh, you're a salamander, off and running once again.
One thing that I think is really interesting about the tone of this story is that the narrator herself doesn't seem to recognize like the injustice of all of these things that happen to her. Like, of all of these situations, she doesn't seem to have any consciousness of herself as having suffered from them unfairly, unjustly. And the reason why I think that's good is, or like interesting and makes it possibly better, is that really it puts it on the reader to recognize what's happening to her as being unfair and unjust. We recognize it for her, or like on her behalf, I guess I should say.
It reminds me, when we did our episode about Michel Bernanos, The Other Side of the Mountain, we started to ask questions about, okay, if this is really so different from Lord of the Rings or something with its fantasy that has a kind of positivity about it, is that because the weird, or whatever the weird is trying to represent, is nature as total indifference or total ambivalence towards humanity? You could just crush it out, doesn't care at all. I wonder if that is what the weird part about the story is. Yes, she transforms. Yes, we cannot tell if she's not an axolotl, if she's a salamander or a human. But I think there's something about showing like humans as representatives of this other weird. They don't really seem like people. They seem like weird dream images. The people who are pursuing her, the people that laugh at her, they're almost like symbolic creatures. And it feels like they are working for, not this is too conspiratorial, but they feel like they are tools of this indifferent world. And it feels like she's the only real person inside of it. It feels kind of really suspect of everything around her, even though she's not feeling like she's being persecuted necessarily. The way that it's depicted, it feels like it is kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, and I think that nightmare is a good comparison because in dreams, things happen, but we don't really think about cause and effect or right and wrong. Things just happen, and you're kind of confused at how you go from point A to point B and what that connection means. And I think that is very much the logic here. Though, there is a distinction, because in a lot of these weird stories, strange things happen. I mean, to put it in the most mildest way possible, strange things happen that don't necessarily logically follow from one another. And I want to read a whole straight 2-paragraph quote that I thought was really, really interesting from Ruthanna Emrys, who was writing about this story in Reactor magazine. And she wants to distinguish between like the weird of the privileged versus the weird of the oppressed. I thought this was really, really fascinating. So she says, Lovecraft's weird, for example, is a weird of privilege. Perched atop the largest mountain he can see, he writes the vertiginous epiphany of how far there is to fall and the inevitability of the drop, and the existential terror that comes when the clouds part and a larger mountain looms beyond vision, showing one's own peak to be a child's mound of sand. The privileged weird is a story of beloved, illusory meaning, forcibly stripped away. The weird of the oppressed, though, of which they're saying this story falls under that category, makes story out of the all too familiar experience of chaotic powers imposing their whims at random, of vast powers and faceless majorities casting aside one's existence out of malice or convenience or mindless focus on their own interests. No shocking revelations, just a scaling upward and outward of everyday horrors. There are 1,000 kaleidoscopic approaches to such scaling, of course, giving the horrors meaning or portraying its lack, mocking the oppressive powers or railing against them, absurdity as a window on how to fight or on a sense of futility. Really perceptive stuff. And I think that it really makes me recognize, especially moving forward, that the weird affects the protagonist. The weird affects the characters in different ways. For some, it's humbling. And for others, it's just like another thing that's like kind of crushing them,
I don't know if I agree with the characterization of H.P. Lovecraft. I feel like the second, the weird of the oppressed seems a lot more like H.P. Lovecraft than the first characterization of H.P. Lovecraft up on his mountain.
I agree with you. As I was reading the second paragraph, I was like, actually, this is kind of how I think about Lovecraft a little bit, but neither here nor there. We can, beside the point, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like they're Lovecraft is definitely in that second camp there, but at least the way that it's described. But, I was thinking, even though there's this indifference, all of these things are kind of throwing at her. It's like just another thing, another terrible day, it seems like, for this poor character. She is still hopeful in a way. And again, it reminds me of Axolotl, where he no longer recognizes that, no, it's not, he recognizes himself twice in two different ways. I am the axolotl, and I am also the person watching the axolotl, and I can no longer distinguish when I'm doing either one. I even start to wonder about that guy who was watching me just a few minutes ago, now going on with his life. It's like there's been a transfer of consciousness from man to axolotl. Here, when she's starting to wonder who she is, she prays. She says, I prayed frantically because I didn't know if I was still a person or only an animal or half person, half animal. I also prayed to know where I was because there were moments when I seemed to be underwater, and when I was underwater, I seemed to be above on land, and I could never know where I really was. Maybe that's the real experience of a salamander, because a salamander is in water, out of water, in water, out of water. But to be suddenly a person and then a salamander, Obviously, that would be pretty nutty. That'd be pretty crazy, Zach. But I think it's a key part of this. It would be crazy. It's interesting that both stories are looking at an animal, becoming that animal, and no longer knowing where you are in this relationship. Are the animal experiencing being human, or the human experiencing being animal? But the praying and wanting to be back into that kind of symbology between humans and gods, or whatever we have that is not animal, trying to get back to that, praying and hoping, will I be able to go back to that? There's a weird futility that is, written well by that person from Reactor. There's a definite feeling of that futility. I would really like to get an answer. I would really like to know if I'm still human. I would really like to get back to my old way of life, but I can't, because I can't tell if I'm above land, on land, or in the water.
I think the last episode I talked about how it felt like the previous one was kind of like a relic from the past. To me, this feels like something coming in from an experimental future. So I'm really curious to know, are we going to get more like this moving forward in the anthology? Is this kind of the future of weird writing, these kind of dream-like states, or is this a one-off? I don't know. I'm really curious to find out. Onward. Let's keep crawling, Bob. Talk to you later.
Eel.